There we go. Okay, that should work. Um, Let me just deal with this echo. Um, there we go. Now we should be good. And you should have sound momentarily. Um, so, we had our gentleman, Exodus, from last night, and he ended up on the wrong video. For some reason, it doubled up and it produced two live events. And I'm not quite sure why. I think it was a mistake on my end when I filled things out. So I'm kind of hoping that Exodus will show up here. Now he subscribed, so he should get an application. But I feel bad if people start leaving comments and start getting involved with the program, and then it's sort of like a problem. We did get here just about on 7 o'clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started by switching you over to the PowerPoint. Now, you had the option to have some of the diagrams from tonight, and so those are still yours if you're at that level. If you want them anyway, again, zionsbanner@gmail.com, and you can go ahead and you can have those diagrams. I just did what I did to Patreon simply because I had promised electronic postcards, and I tried everything with Zapper to make that happen. The other thing is occasionally I'm going to go ahead and create an unlisted video that Patreon folks will have, but Facebook, our Facebook page will have it too. And it'll just be an update on some musings from the programs. Calendar. I want to put up my calendar, tell you about upcoming events, what I hope for those outreaches so that you and the community who want to pray can be praying for those outreaches, just in terms of some modest goals, what I'd like to see, how it went. Some people do not get my Chosen People newsletter. And so I feel like there's a part of the community that doesn't get to really interact. And the newsletter from Chosen People doesn't allow me any musings. And so I'm working on musings with Jeff that'll just be short little, there'll be like video vlogs that'll occur every so often, probably like once a month. Probably. So even though they're unlisted, look for them on Facebook, Zion's Banner, or on Patreon, and all patrons will have access to them because I want to keep you guys informed, and my newsletters only go to some people. So, well, let's get started on this topic. I hadn't thought about this topic this way until I started delving in it and then thought about what theological questions this topic raises. And so I was excited as I started to prepare this to be able to cover really a lot of things. Um, and I'm just going to send out a general, but just by way. Um, I see some folks back, and I see some folks that are becoming more regular, and so that's exciting to me. Um, and just a quick um, Radical Love is in the room, and a bunch of other folks are, and this is really great. Um, I'll do a little advertising for the conference. I can't wait to start advertising for the Muslim conference. I will be putting up that schedule because I will be speaking 3 times in a row at the Muslim Apologetics Conference here in Phoenix, which will include me going out and doing some mosque outreach and then speaking 3 times in a row, twice for a training session before the actual conference and mosque outreach. And then on the Friday night before I fly out to Louisiana, to do some speaking for Chosen People. So I am really excited, and I will begin to plug that and put the calendar of events up. Now, some of you folks can't be here, but I want to tape or see if I can get live any of the material I do. So I'm going to work on making that happen, and then you'll have access to it, particularly if it's new or interesting stuff. If it looks so much like the old stuff, maybe I'll consider, but then I still might do it as a premiere. So let's get going. But I am excited about some of the things I'm thinking about doing and the way they're going to end up occurring. And for the folks in the room. So we're going to start on our PowerPoint. That's supposed to be nudge. I wanted to be nice in Yiddish. Um, should we nudge God and about what? But really, we're going to ask a question that the passage forces: Does God or is God ever listen to the prayers of the unsaved? So let me give you some background. Now, if you have your Bibles, okay, the PowerPoint will have some of the material up, but I want to encourage you when I'm doing the background. I don't usually have the verses up. So I'm going to have you turn to the actual scripture. We're in Matthew 7 through 12. That's the pericope we're going to be dealing with. And I want to give you some background here. Jesus has already talked about prayer. Why bring this stuff up again? Again, because he's dealing with issues of the day. You're going to find out that the Jewish people have liturgical prayer. In other words, by the time Jesus enters, there's the beginning of a system of prayer beginning to form with regular prayers, set prayers. We call it liturgy. So that's why this is coming up, because liturgy, it's becoming liturgical, it's becoming rote, it's becoming very set. And the Pharisees in particular had certain prayer habits. And so Jesus is going to talk about prayer, but in contrast to rote, repetitious prayer, he's going to talk about persistent petitioning of God. And so liturgical prayer became a feature of Judaism. Jesus isn't going to focus on repetitious prayer. By the way, he already did that. But he is going to focus on personal petition as opposed to formal corporate prayer and the persistence of it. So that gives you a reason why he might want to deal with this. If you're used to corporate prayer and you're used to liturgical prayer, what happens to your personal prayer life? And that was a question I sort of had from my mom. I said, well, I kind of felt like I want to express myself to God. I want to worship and praise Him. And Judaism was terribly liturgical. And so I remember sitting down and writing my own prayers in the form of what Jewish prayers were like. And I remember doing that and wanting to pray my own prayers and praise God. So I used the same formula, blessed art thou, O Lord, and then filled it in with some things for me. But as much as I could use them in my personal life, I couldn't use them outside my personal life. And so Jesus is going to go ahead and do this contrast. Now, I'm going to switch over and we're going to talk about the basis of persistent petitionary prayer. And I should have for you this section right here. Let me go to it. I'm putting up the diagram that you should have. There you go. And I'm going to go to this. And you should see that diagram right there. Now, you're allowed to have those diagrams, but what I want to do is instead of having me there, I want you to be able to see this better. And so you can see that kind of section here. And what I've done is I've taken this first section here, and Luke repeats the same thing. So what is the basis for petitionary prayer? And it may have jumped for you, and I'm sorry if it did that. It shouldn't have. don't know why. There we go. Um, and what I've done is I put the verses up here. Now, a cool practice is verse diagramming. This should settle down in just a minute. And I'm sorry it's jumping a little bit. But give it a second to come back. And I've taken the Luke passage, which is the same basic passage here. Okay, and 7 is the same in both. Now, what Matthew 7 is, Luke 11:9 through 13 is. Okay? And this thing keeps jumping. And I don't know why it does that. So I'm going to pull that off. And just give it a second. My mouse is like going nuts tonight. There you go. And you can see it. Now there are 3 imperatives there. Notice the blue lines. Those are commands or imperatives. That's what I really wanted to get to. And that's what you're looking at. Every time I touch this thing, it goes back to jumping. So I'm going to minimize this window here for a second so that it can't do that. And I'll switch back to it. And so there you go. You have your 3 imperatives that are there. Those are commands. You have the basic command ask, then you have the command seek, and then you have the command knock. So God commands us to pray. He uses 3 different imperatives to go ahead and do it, and that forms the basis of persistent petitioning God for things. And it's going to jump for a little bit. Just the night. I'm asking the Lord that He'll settle down the technology, and I'm seeking for Him to go ahead and help us with a little bit of these diagrams. And I know that it will be given to us tonight because I believe this is in line with His will. And there you have it. And so you should see that come up in a second. It does give you a nice tour of the neat diagrams that you can have that go over this section. And so that should jump over in a minute here. No, because it jumped to 3 again. Do not know why that's doing that. There we go. And so that should be back with you in just a second here. And so you see those 3 commands. Now let's look at the Greek words. Okay. Aitaite. Then you have the other Greek word there. Now I don't have my Greek up, but you can see the Greek word that is translated knock. And then you see the word seek. And again, this is jumping. And so I do not know why this is doing this. Seek is there. Zelaitaite is seek, and they're all imperatives. And I'm going to just move us on here because for some reason this is jumping a lot more than I would prefer that it actually go ahead and jump. And so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and I'll go back to the diagrams as we deal with it. But this forms the basis for our petitioning. We're commanded to. That's what really gives us the freedom to. We're commanded to by God. And so here's the question. Who's being spoken to? Who's in the audience? And I've often heard it said that God does not hear or answer the prayers of unsaved people. But does this passage here, which commands seeking, knocking, and asking, preclude unredeemed people? And that's why that question came up in my mind. And so let's just keep moving on. And now we have an apologetics sort of issue or a theological issue we need to deal with. Who's in the crowd? Now remember, Jesus is talking to the disciples, but there are others overhearing him. And so how do we understand these commands? Do we understand them as being directed primarily to the disciples, but excluding the unredeemed? Do we understand them primarily being to the disciples, but still having some application for the wider scope? So, there is no indication that the group that Jesus is speaking to, that's overhearing him, not the disciples, but the wider audience. Remember, he's on a mountain giving the new law as the new Moses to the disciples, which are representative, and then the wider audience. We do not know that everybody in that audience is saved. And so this really does allow us to investigate an important theological question. And when I'm reading, I ask questions of God. I think that's the way we should read the scriptures. We should ask questions of the passage. We should ask questions of God. We should examine what's going on here. And so that's exactly what I did. As I was preparing this, I started asking theological questions. What's going on here? Who's he talking about? Who's the audience? When he gives these commands, do they have wider application for the wider audience? And since the wider audience isn't clearly all redeemed and regenerate people yet, what does that say about God and prayer and the unredeemed? So what I did was a yes, but. So let's look at the yes, but, and we're going to start by looking at the yes. Now I turned to Matthew 5:45. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes the sun to rise on the evil and good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. The fact that God can hear the prayers of the unsaved, I shouldn't say God can hear the prayers of the unsaved, because God is all powerful. The fact that it is not true that God will never hear the prayers of the unsaved is consistent with his generosity. Or put another way, the fact that God will sometimes hear the prayers of the unsaved is consistent with God's generosity not being limited to the saved. In other words, when Jesus talks about God's generosity, it is not limited to the saved. So why should God not hear the prayers of the unsaved sometimes? Now, I've heard it put the other way. I've had people tell me that God will not hear the prayers of the unsaved ever. But that would not be consistent with God's generosity not being limited to the saved. And Jesus indicates that God's generosity extends beyond just the redeemed. Here's another way of looking at this as we try to get to this question. If God can't hear the prayers of the unsaved, and the unsaved happen to pray for something God's going to do, then he would be unable to answer that prayer. And thus he would be unable to do that thing because he would be violating himself. Well, here's the interesting thing about that. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. Okay. The Jewish people have been praying for Messiah to return. Now, they have not had the right person, but they have had the right expectation in terms of Messiah eventually coming. Now, their expectation of what Messiah would be like is wrong, but their expectation that Messiah will indeed come is correct. Can we agree to that? Well, if Orthodox Jews are praying for Messiah to come, and by the way, they do it every morning and evening, the Shemona Esrei talks about God bringing Messiah, a Redeemer, for the sake of his love for the patriarchs. And that's prayed several times a day, every day by Jewish people. But are the Jewish people as a whole saved? Well, no, there wouldn't be any need for Jewish missionaries if Jewish people as a whole were saved. So I have to believe, especially because the synagogues are places for practicing non rabbinical Jews, that most Jews who are praying the Shemona Esrei are indeed unsaved. Well, they're praying for the return of the Messiah, and at least two of the benedictions related to the Shemona Esrei. If that's true, and God can't answer the prayers of the unredeemed, he cannot bring Messiah back, which means Jesus could not return. And I hope you followed that reasoning. You have a group of people praying for something that is God's will, but they, as a group, are primarily unsaved or unredeemed or not in covenant with God. And they are regularly praying for that if God cannot or will never hear the prayers of the unsaved, then their prayers as Israel corporate, even though in an unregenerate state, is something God could never answer. Therefore, if Jesus returns, he would be doing so, and that would answer the prayers of an unregenerate corporate group of people, a whole lot of unredeemed people. Now that may sound a little convoluted, but I think about all these Jewish people, including my great grandparents, praying for Messiah's return, and thinking to myself, if God couldn't answer that prayer, then Messiah couldn't return. And by the way, I don't know many churches that every Sunday pray Maranatha for the Lord's return. That's kind of interesting to me because most Jewish synagogues have at least two benedictions prayed at least twice a day for Messiah's return, and I rarely see such devotion to praying for that in the Christian church. Isn't that kind of interesting? Maybe we can learn a little something from that. It's also consistent with other verses about seeking God. Are there verses that encourage people to seek God? Well, there are verses that encourage people to seek God, and they aren't right here in Matthew. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. Jeremiah 29:13. I love that verse. But from there, you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. Deuteronomy 4:29. Now, there are some principles that will be covered later to this because I said God answers sometimes the prayers of the unsaved, yes, but, and we'll talk about the but in just a little while. But I want to assure you of something. When Jeremiah goes ahead and utters these words in 29:13, it's a prophecy around the time of the Babylonian captivity where they're going to be taken out of Israel due to sin and due to the nation not following God's covenant. Not very consistent with a totally saved nation, right? In Deuteronomy, it's God's prediction that they will sin and break the covenant. And one of the punishments for breaking the covenant, God says, if you don't keep my covenant, I will exile you. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses gives them some hope. He says, and when from there, you being exiled, seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and soul. So really, Deuteronomy is the prediction of what God will do when they break his covenant and that they should seek him and he will hear them. And then Jeremiah is you're going into exile, as Moses said would happen if you don't keep the covenant. What you need to do is know that God will indeed hear you if you seek him, and you will find him. And the Jews do return from Babylon. So there are verses about seeking God that seem to be talking to a group of people that are not all redeemed and regenerate. And so the fact that these verses could have a wider application is consistent with other verses about seeking God and asking of God and praying to God. Now, the but is really important here. I want to make it perfectly clear There is a distinction between God's answering a prayer for the redeemed and his answering a prayer sometimes for the unredeemed or those outside the covenant. So I want to be very clear about that. It's not the same. Both verses, Jeremiah 29 and Deuteronomy 4, are in the context of promises to Israel as a corporate people. So the way I explained this to a Sunday school class, when someone who was teaching it said God does not answer the prayers of unsaved people, and I had to sort of butt in and give some of these arguments, very politely I said, well, I have a problem with that because, okay, is God is under no covenant obligation to answer the prayers of the unsaved. They're not in covenant, so God doesn't have a covenant obligation. Now, God is not obligated to say yes to what you request either, but God has a covenant obligation to hear your prayers and to respond to them. He does not have an covenant obligation in the case of the unredeemed. And that's the way, by the way, Dr. Glazer put it. And he says basically much the same thing. The difference between you and the unredeemed person is you are in covenant with God, and God has taken upon himself certain covenant obligations towards you because you are in covenant in Messiah Jesus. God has not taken those covenant obligations upon himself in the case of the unredeemed. So God is not obligated to answer the prayers of the unsaved in any way. He is not obligated to respond to them, but he can respond to them. Second, God will never violate his will, so the prayers of unsaved people which are sinful or contrary to his will, God will not answer, for he's consistent with himself and zealous for his own name. So when unsaved people pray things that are against God's will, which will be I can't say every time, but I can say that their prayers will be dominated by things that are not God's will because they do not know him and they're not in relationship to him. He is not obligated to respond to those at all. But what about the Orthodox Jew praying for Messiah to return? Well, that is in keeping with God's will. And so God would not be violating himself to answer that prayer. And the unsaved Jewish person is not presently on an individual as an individual in covenant with God. Oh, wouldn't that drive Rabbi Singer nuts? Just absolutely would drive him crazy to hear someone say that. But the reality is no, you do not get to be in covenant because you follow the rabbis and use their substitutes for the temple system that God himself put in place. And you're not in covenant if you're not in the new covenant because that's been inaugurated. And so, no, you may be zealous for God, as Paul says he was before he became saved, but you are not enjoying covenant. You are part of God's ancient covenant people, but you personally are not walking in covenant with God, and you're not in a position of covenant on an individual basis. Your people still have covenant, and you're part of a people. I got to be careful about that. Let me restate that carefully and nuanced to keep my theology straight. You are part of God's ancient people for which he still has promises even though they aren't in covenant. That's the theological way to go ahead and explain that. Okay. What about verses that indicate that God will never answer the prayers of the unsaved? Now we have to look at God's full counsel and we have to deal with these verses. That's good apologetics. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. The verse that's being referred to is Proverbs 15:29. Now, first of all, understand that Proverbs is not a systematic theology. It's general statements about the way things usually are. I'm not saying it's incorrect. I'm saying we just don't want to misuse it. Okay? Um, but I want to talk about the word there. When he says that God is far from the wicked, there's a prefix there, and then you have the Hebrew word for wicked. It's a little small for you to be able to see. I'm going to bring it up just a little bit. Okay. Rishaim from Ra. But this is in reference to people. It's not just your average neighbor across the street that doesn't know Messiah yet. Okay. Um, Ernest Jenny and Klaus Westerman, and I went to their theological lexicon of the Old Testament. Very good resource. Rash, the Hebrew word there is used in Psalms to describe enemies and evildoers of various types. Now let's listen to the types of evildoers in mind in Proverbs and Psalm. The enemy of the people or of the king, i.e., enemy nations, who represent direct opposition to God's people and want to see them not succeed or see them fail or be destroyed or put to shame. Powerful oppressors of poor, widows, orphans, sojourners. Former friends who have proven faithless. I don't mean friends who have made a mistake, okay, but turncoats. People who speak cordially but intend evil. That's the person stabbing you in the back while having coffee with you to your face, deliberately. In secret, they express their ruinous words. They prefer at night when evil deeds have their greatest potency. Their evil words, they dig graves and lay snares. This is all expressions common in Babylon for curses and magical arts that cause people every manner of evil. So the idea is that the wicked here are not your average unsaved person who is generally being nice to you, may even be respectful of your faith. We're talking about classes of wicked people that are actively engaged in ruinous, terrible behavior. And so there are set categories in Proverbs. Now, I'm not saying the unsaved are righteous apart from Jesus Christ. What I'm saying is that the psalmist and the one writing Proverbs has specific type of evil people in mind, not generally fallen people in mind. Okay. I went to Kyle and Dulwich, a very good source. God is far from the godless, and then he has someone remark in nice, looks like Latin, more correctly, as to his gracious presence, he has withdrawn from them, and so he does uh, not he never hears their prayer, but he doesn't hear their prayers because he has withdrawn himself because they are unwelcoming of his presence. They do not want him. Here's the other problem. If the unsaved cannot have their prayers heard, then nobody can pray for salvation. Because everyone who prays for salvation prays at a moment when they are unsaved, or they wouldn't be asking for salvation to begin with. Now, the way the hard Calvinist gets around this is by saying they're elect, but they do not know they're elect. And they are still unsaved. God's election doesn't save by itself without believing in Jesus, because I was elect before I was saved. And if election alone saved me, then I would not need to accept him at all. So that doesn't help you out of anything. In a temporal sort of way, at the moment the person's praying for salvation, he is not saved. God would still be hearing the prayer of an unsaved person. It'd just be an unsaved person who was going to become a saved person. Which, by the way, once the saved person has completed their plea to God and accepted the work that Christ has done on their behalf, they are an unsaved person who has become a saved person. Have they not? If they sincerely did this? I went to Ezekiel 18:20 through 22. Now listen to this. If the wicked man turns from all his sins which he's committed and keeps my statutes and does what is right and lawful, he shall surely live and he shall not die. None of the transgressions he has committed will be remembered against him, because the righteousness he has done, he shall live. Now, is this saying that someone's saved by works? No, it's not. Ezekiel is talking in a very frame of reference. God is assuring Israel that if Israel turns from her sin, she will indeed find his grace. And God is promising the wicked man that there is grace that God can extend to him if he repents. But not if God can't hear the prayers of the unredeemed. That would not be possible. Furthermore, as we look at the rest of the verses, you'll notice something interesting. If you're back at Matthew and you look at verse 8, to everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. Who's everyone? Let's not make this overly complicated. Everyone is everyone. And the Greek backs this up. Now let me go back here to our section and see if I can pull this. Okay. And so we have the verse up there, everyone who asks. Everyone is everyone. And in the Greek, it's literally everyone. Well, that can't be true if everyone is not everyone. Whosoever believes on him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Who's in whosoever? Well, whosoever is everybody. Okay? Whoever. So the reason for answered prayer is God's goodness, and everyone includes a wider application to the audience, but is specifically guaranteed to the disciples who are in covenant, or to those who are in covenant with Jesus. By the way, my understanding is that all the disciples are present. We do know there was at least one disciple that was not regenerate, interestingly enough. So, the grounds for answered prayer is given. It's God's goodness. Now let's talk about light to heavy. Jesus is going to produce an argument here, which I want you to pay attention to. It's the way he goes ahead and deals with things. And so I want to kind of deal with this argument. By the way, if everyone's out there, were you tracking with, I think that, there's good ground laid that God can answer the prayers of the unsaved? You're free to chime in, and hopefully you'll follow this light to heavy argument. Or what man is it there among you who, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? And Jesus is going to go talk about normal human decent behavior. Or if he asks for a fish, verse 10, will give him a serpent. Notice the two ors in 9 and 10. Same sort of Greek construction. Okay. And you see the ors there. The same or is used twice. I have that listed up there for you. The Greek word is given. I'm going to go ahead bring that fully up. And there's the Greek word, and you have both ors. The dotted line represents the first or, and then the second or, if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? And I just put the Greek word up there, and this thing just loves, I don't know what it is, to jump around tonight. And so it may jump briefly for a second. There you go. And I'm sorry about that jump. It's jumping to the third. Maybe time to get a new mouse. because it's really acting up tonight. Okay. Oh, wow. Someone's doing double duty, and this moved again, did it? And I know why, because it seems to confuse which window it's on. There we go. That should help. So there's our or. And Jesus is forming one of these light to heavy arguments based on the image of God in man. Man is an image bearer, and so you can argue from correspondence, but not fully, because man is sinful, and God is the source of all good. Okay, but because man is an image bearer, we can make arguments from correspondence. When we say God is our Father, there are certain things that are ideally part of fatherhood that would be true of God, because God is the model. We are the image bearers. God is the source and model. And then there is the position or role of fatherhood. And so he's making this very thing that decent human beings made in God's image, displaying God's image, would behave in such a way towards their own son that if he asks for bread, you would not give him a stone. And if he asks for, and I'm just looking at the other section here, if he asks for a fish, you would not give him a poisonous snake. I think that's the idea behind servant. If we know how to, and he's going to make the point that given we're image bearers, we in some way reflect God. The decent, proper way to display God's image tells us something about what God would do. And so this is a light to heavy. The image of God in man being the light. In other words, not light like we're thinking light expeditions, but light in the sense of the lesser. Then God, the greater, will do more or will do better. And so there's your lesser. Okay. And I don't know if it jumped to 3 again. Yes, it did. There we go. And so I'm going to go to the lesser there. And then we're going to move from there to the greater. Okay. And so you have your lesser, and that's why those ors are there. And then we're going to move to the greater. Now we're going to talk about Greek class conditions. For the first time, that moved to the right place. Good. We're going to talk about class conditions. If you're looking at Matthew 7:11, if you then, see the word if then are class conditions in Greek, but Greek doesn't have one, but has several types of class conditions. Okay? And so what we're looking at is those class conditions in the Greek. And so I'm going to go ahead. That's showing. I don't know that it should be, but that's okay. And I'm going to move you through that. But we have different class conditions. And so I'm moving you to this. And we're going to talk about a first class condition. Now in Greek, if then can be taken several ways. You could have if this, then that in the sense of a hypothetical. You could have if this, then that, but I don't think that will ever happen. Contrary to fact. You can have an if this, and we're assuming this is true, then that will also occur. Now, this is a first class condition in Greek. I'm going to tell you why some of this stuff's important, okay? It indicates that the if is being assumed to be true and is being treated as a fact, or that we're assuming the if is true for the sake of argument. So we're assuming it's true because it honestly is or is believed to be, or we're assuming it's true in order to make the argument, and within the argument, it is considered true. Now, why did I go ahead and do this? Okay, and I'll tell you why I spent so much time on this week. There are verses that say, if you continue in the faith, you will be saved. People pull this on all the time on me. What they don't understand is class conditions in Greek. If you remain in the faith, first class condition, I assume you will remain in the faith. Then it naturally follows, since it is assumed you will remain in the faith, that you will be saved. It is not a hypothetical if, like maybe you won't remain in the faith, but it's assumed to be true that naturally the natural position of someone who's saved is to remain in the faith, and so they end up saved. Do you see the difference? When those verses come up and they're not first, and depending on the class condition, but if we're talking about a first class condition, we're not talking about the assumption that someone will lose their salvation. We're talking about the assumption that someone will stay in the faith, and what the natural result of staying in the faith is. So this removes a lot of these verses pulled out by people to undermine the security of salvation, because they're not understanding Greek conditions. Someone pulled this at me when I was speaking at a Nazarene church. I wasn't going to bring it up. And I said, Lord, if you want me to bring it up, someone's going to ask me a question about it. And then some young lady said, my friend is, she said a Calvinist. I'm a biblicist. But she was using the term Calvinist. She said, they believe that once saved, always saved. And I said, dear, first of all, I don't believe once saved, always saved. I believe once saved, completely saved. And if I'm completely saved, then I'm not going to be completely lost. And I said, now let me explain this to you. And one of the pastors, a female pastor, for better or worse, pulled one of these verses out, and I said, yes, and if I had wings, I would fly. But this verse isn't indicating you can lose your salvation. This verse is assuming that you will remain in the faith, and the results of being part of the faith are that you are saved. So you're misusing the verse. So this class condition stuff really does become important. Now, in this case, Jesus is assuming, okay, something very important. If you being evil, we're right down here near, if you then being evil, okay, statement of fact for the sake of argument, okay, if you being evil, being not perfectly good, being flawed, having the image of God in you tainted, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven, who is perfect, who is the greater, who is untainted, give good gifts to his children when they ask? Okay? And so it's a light to heavy argument with a first class condition. And hopefully you're seeing that first class condition as I go back here. And I took you to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to try transitioning this and see which slide we're on. We're on 3. I'm going to instantly go down here, not touch this, and see there's your if, first class condition, assumption of truth. The if is a, okay, in the Greek, there's the particle, and that's the construction that we're dealing with. There is no second Greek word then. There's often a second Greek word then, but a first-class condition will have A in the first part. That's called the protasis, okay? And it'll have that Greek word in the first part. It does. And then you have the apodosis is the then, and there's usually a Greek word there. But there is no secondary Greek word here, but you have the construction that allows this, from all the research I did, to be a first-class condition. And so Jesus is assuming, on the base of his argument, that human beings are flawed and sinful, and they still know how, bearing the image of God, to give good gifts. And so God, all the greater, light to heavy, will give good gifts to those who petition him, who are his children. So that's why I took you here. I also did this for another reason. Okay? I'm pulling up the PowerPoint and going back there, but here's the secondary reason I did this. I am dealing with unsaved people all the time. Do you say to an unsaved person, why don't you ask God to show you if Jesus is real? Can you say that to an unsaved person? Can you say to an unsaved person, you know what? I've shared a lot of things with you tonight, and you're going to have to come to all your own decision. And I urge you to look at the evidence, but I want you to do a little interesting experiment, because I have firsthand experience that my wife loves me, and that experience is valid because I'm there. And so I want you to be able to go beyond asking the questions, but I want you to be able to get an answer. And I want you to try this experiment, not because the fact that you have an experience makes something true, but sometimes our experience confirms things that are true, or helps us see things that are true that we might have otherwise missed. So, after the end of the day, if you're willing, I would say to you, it would be a good thing to ask God to confirm to your soul that the things you heard from me are true. And examine the evidence while you're doing it, but ask him to confirm as you're looking over that evidence whether it's true or not. And so I believe very much in logic, but I believe that faith is important too. Reason without unaided faith isn't very reasonable, and faith without reason just becomes wishful thinking. And so, and I think the basis of saying that is because God could answer that prayer. If God can't answer the prayer of the unsaved person when I'm telling him to ask God whether this is real, to make himself real to that person, well, if God can't answer the prayers of unsaved person, he can't answer that prayer. There's no biblical basis for me to say that. But if I could say that while Jesus is talking about his covenant obligation to those who follow him, but extends his goodness to those who are not yet following him, and can and will sometimes answer the prayers of the unsaved, then I have a basis for asking someone to do that. And you know, when you're putting that as an experiment, as an apologist or as an evangelist, you could say, look, you've got nothing to lose. If God isn't there and he doesn't exist, then you won't hear anything back. It'll be like sending a letter to an address that's not there. The worst you get is a returned letter. But if he is there, not ignoring the evidence, search it out. But if he is there and you're asking him to confirm hard research that you're doing, then you have all the more reason to believe. You have the research and you have the confirmation that goes with that research that you've handled the facts well. So that's why I spent some of the time, because either this section of scripture allows me to ask an unbeliever to do that, or if it doesn't and other verses don't either, then I can't ask an unbeliever to do that. Because our evangelism should follow good theology. It's not evangelism or good theology. It's evangelism and good theology. It's not apologetics or good theology. It's apologetics based on good theology. So that's why I spend some time on this. Okay, the basis for God's answering these prayers is that God is good. Every time we go to God in prayer, we are, in a sense, acting upon the fact that we believe God is good. We're affirming our belief in God's goodness. Because would I ask somebody who is bad who wasn't going to answer me? And so we are affirming God's goodness when we do that. And that's the basis. The basis isn't us. The basis isn't the brilliance of the request. The basis is the goodness of God. So let me conclude. Prayer is an act of trust in the goodness of God. How's that for a sermon conclusion? I don't know, it's not perfectly 3 points in a poem, is it? But I think it's still worthwhile. And so Jesus, in terms of prayer, focuses not on repetitious, liturgical prayer, but he talks to them about personal prayer, assuming that that will be a part of their life too, as well as the corporate stuff, and basically talks to them about the need for a persistent trust in the goodness of God expressed through believing, persistent prayer. And we're going to see a parable about how persistent we should be. Should we nudge God? Yes, I think sometimes we should nudge God, to borrow from the Yiddish. And while we're nudging God, we're aware that while he is covenantly in relationship with us to answer our prayers, he can go beyond that and answer the prayers of the unsaved when they don't violate his will and when he in his graciousness wants to do so. And that would be especially true if an unsaved person was seeking the answers to questions that are spiritual and related to redemption. Well, I'm sorry about the glitches, and I know it got a little complicated tonight, but I'm really hoping that the discussion of class conditions was good, that the evidence that God can go outside and answer the prayers of the unsaved was good, and that the idea that you can ask an unsaved person to pray about the things you're sharing with him now has a basis in the generosity of God, who gives good gifts to those who ask. And there is no better gift than his giving in Jesus. And I would love to know any thoughts people have too while I'm up here, because we can have some discussion community-wise. Well, by the way, one of my favorite, one of our really dear supportive people is thinking about all this, so I hope he thinks it's good, despite all the technical glitches. We will be dealing with Jesus contrasting wide and narrow ways, and how to discuss or to determine and to discern those who are indicating a false message. So that should be real good for next Thursday. And again, look for those little musings. I'm getting out and about, want to share about what I want to do when I go out and about sharing, what has happened, and maybe a few thoughts about interesting things that come up in regards to these broadcasts. Give you a taste of what's coming up broadcast-wise, where you can find out what the upcoming messages are. So there'll be these little tiny, we'll call them vlogs that'll be seen. You can go to Facebook, Zion's Banner's Facebook page. Or if you're a patron, you'll see them there. And I want to encourage you, you know, that's a way to keep in touch, is that Facebook page. If you're not on Facebook because you've been hacked or tracked, or things have been stacked against you on Facebook, there are other ways to do that. I may post them maybe on our website, zionsbanner.org. So, good stuff. Yeah, if you don't use Facebook, and some of you don't, and Radical Love says she doesn't use Facebook anymore, I respect that. Our website may have them. I'm also going to have them as unlisted videos, because really this is more for the community. It's kind of family communication, and I want to kind of keep it that way. But I can go ahead, and if I have an email or something, I can email links, or Radical Love, you can drop me an idea on how. I don't know if with unlisted videos whether you can send somebody the URL. I think you can, but I want to keep our stuff. I don't know if I want to tell people, after sharing with Muslims, I don't know if I want to tell them exactly which airline I'm getting on. If martyrdom comes, it is God's doing. So. Okay. So a neat comment there. So I'm telling somebody to, okay. I am such a bad typer. So if you see a mistyped word, just know it's me. Okay. Oh, Radical. Yeah, I will share that with you. Patreon link. Here, let me put that up. Someone asked about the Patreon link. I appreciate people who support us through Chosen People, but we want to do more, and we do more, but we don't do less. That's my standard line. I believe this is the way it's stated on. So it's real easy. It's just Zion's Banner, and it's at the Patreon site. So I don't know if that'll appear as a link or not. It didn't appear as a link. Okay. Okay, I don't know what to tell you. I thought it would link. So that's really kind of weird. I'm going to check out the link real quick. Okay. I'm just going to quickly try and grab this link real quick. This is the first time I've grabbed a link on a show. So I just want to see what happens if you grab a link and put it in and hit it. I've always wondered, so now I'm going to find out. And that did not work because I didn't grab it right. Okay, that's my fault. So now I know what happens. Okay, that link should work. So I just tested it. So Radical Love, you can go right there. In fact, I'll pop the link in here again, and maybe it'll appear as a link. There you go. There it is. It works, but does work if you put it in right. And I got a question. Okay. Someone is a better typist. I am so bad. I like flunked typing class. It's that and I thing. It's the same thing with writing. It's a hand-eye thing. So, excellent. Well, I'm going to bring the music up. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that. Well, I'm going to try. Okay. I know there's a bit of a timer up there. There shouldn't be. So I'm going to get rid of that. There we go. I'm going to bring the music up just a little bit, but I'm still here. We're just going to bring it up just a little bit, just in the background there, because it's kind of nice. There we go. Well, thank you, everybody. Radical Love says post the link in the Dropbox for this video. I'm just going to ask Radical Love real quick. What's the Dropbox for the video? Or is that something you're doing? I'm just going to ask.